to this week's edition of Elections Weekly, our weekly discussion show where we talk about politics and election news. I'm Eric Cunningham, editor-in-chief of Elections Daily. With us this week, we have Joe Szymanski, the head of our elections team, and we have Dylan Wade, who's a contributor for Elections Daily.
Hello.
This has been a pretty interesting week for politics. We have a lot to go over in the 45 minutes or so we got you. So we're going to try to make it as comprehensive as we can over that. We have a rough guide of what we're going to want to go over first, but I think we'll start with the Ohio news, given it's the most pertinent to elections. So, the Ohio Supreme Court has overruled the legislative maps that were passed by the Ohio Legislature earlier this year, in the 4-3 ruling, which included the Republican justice siding with the 3 Democrats on the Ohio Supreme Court. Determined that the maps were not proportional enough under the Ohio Constitution, and has ordered the maps to be redrawn. Now, it's worth noting a couple things. One, this ruling does not apply to the congressional districts, and the same type of ruling would not work for the congressional districts. The Ohio Constitution uses 2 different standards, one for legislative districts, which is more proportional, and the one for congressional districts, which only indicates that they shouldn't have been drawn with a partisan intent. That's a fairly vague and meaningless term that courts can interpret a lot of different ways. And so a purely proportional Ohio map is not going to happen. It's worth noting, even if one did happen under the same standards the Ohio Supreme Court has, which is about a 54-46 generic split. We're talking a generic ballot, not presidential. That would in theory be 7-6 Democratic in Ohio. The problem is 3 of those Democratic seats would be tenuous at best, and likely to flip at worst. 3 to 4 of them in all likelihood. So even if the worst case scenario for that happens for Republicans, Democrats shouldn't be necessarily resting on their chops. It might actually be better for them to hope for something smaller, like for example, an 8-5 map, where you have a seat in Cincinnati, you have 2 in Columbus, and then you have 2 in the Cleveland area. That would probably be safer for them long term. But in all likelihood, it's going to be very challenging to do anything from the angle proportional-wise. That being said, the legislative maps do matter. Ohio is not a competitive state at this point at the federal level. And it's not really that competitive at the state level, but what this does mean is that Republicans will likely have a much smaller legislative majority than they do right now. The Ohio legislature has long been dominated by Republicans. I think Democrats have only controlled it for a handful of years. Right now, the Senate has a 25-8 Republican majority, and then the Ohio House has a 64-35 majority. So both of them have a veto-proof supermajority. In all likelihood, those numbers will be substantially reduced. The question is how much. Ohio is a very, very bad state for Democrats geographically, to put it lightly. It also has VRA concerns specifically in the Cleveland area, which would make it difficult to draw a truly proportional map, even if you're using a blind standard. So I'll go ahead and throw it to Joe here to give his thoughts on the state and what impact this could have going forward.
Yeah, it's a very fascinating ruling today by the Ohio Supreme Court. You know, it's something that we not necessarily expected the way to rule as they did, but I think it was something that we kind of thought would be coming, in which they would strike down the maps. I was surprised that they decided to rule on it by a proportionality ruling. I feel like, again, geography in Ohio, it feels like it could be incredibly hard to reach that proportionality level, but obviously they are going to be forced to try. It's going to be something that's going to be very interesting to watch, but like Eric said, this doesn't necessarily affect the House map, and I still think the House map is trending to where I thought it would be. When the original arguments were finished in front of the Ohio Supreme Court, I believed I said there'd be two seats created newly for Democrats. I said I believe there'd be created a kind of Cincinnati-based vote sync where it'd be a solidly Democratic seat based entirely in the city of Cincinnati. And I also tweeted out and said that I believed that there would be a new slightly Democratic seat around Biden +5 +6 based around the Cleveland suburbs and the city of Akron. I think those are the 2 seats. I still expect that. I still do not know. I still severely doubt a move around the city of Columbus that could create a second blue seat. And I am still doubtful, not, certain, of course, but doubtful that they move things around in the Toledo base seat. I really think where these two moves that we're going to see here to help Democrats in Ohio with their congressional map, I do think there's going to be an Cleveland suburbs to Akron based district that would be around Biden plus 5 or 6, still definitely competitive in 2022. And I do think that there is going to be a Cincinnati vote sink that will probably be around Biden plus 20 points, which in no way is going to be competitive and will for sure add on a district from Ohio to Democrats' lists. That is for sure. I think that's what's going to happen. We're going to see what's going to happen with how they're going to kind of react to this ruling by the Ohio Supreme Court today. But, it's going to be something that's definitely going to be fascinating to see. We're going to see how big it goes. And remember that in swing years, weird things can happen. Maybe even with this for 2020 going into 2022 and after 2022, maybe Ohio legislative majorities maybe aren't changed that much just because weird nonsense happens. And, people decide to elect Republicans in areas that we did not think they would elect Republicans. It happens in Wade years, especially in those type of seats. So, it'll be fascinating to see. I'm excited to see it. And we're going to see kind of how the state reacts to it.
Yep. And I'll go ahead and show just for comparison here, this is what a potential fair map of Ohio could look like. And I just want to give you an idea of how bad the Ohio geography really is for Democrats here. If you look at this right now, there are 15 congressional districts. Under this map, there's a seat in Cleveland, there's 2 in Columbus, there's 1 around Toledo, so that's 4 seats right there, and then there's another 3 around the Cleveland area in Akron. The problem is, notice all of these other Democratic seats, aside from the main 3, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, the three big cities in Ohio, are actually really tenuous districts. The 9th district here only goes Democratic by about 130, 150 votes, which is not really that many votes, all things considering. The 7th district here is only about Biden plus 4. The 13th is only Biden plus 1.5, and then the 12th is only Biden plus 6. This one actually is trending Democratic. So this is the best hope for them long term because the Columbus suburbs are really shifting that much. But apply the same geography down to scale, and you'll notice the problem here. The 9th here, Toledo, is mainly Democratic because of the city of Toledo. The problem is you can't really split it for legislative districts too much. You can't crack the county out. All this area around Cleveland, again, you just apply the same standard. You could have a lot of districts which are nominally competitive, but in a state like Ohio, we're still going to vote for Republicans, even if they have a little bit of a Democratic lean federally. We saw this in one of the Columbus districts, remained Republican, even though on paper it's a pretty Democratic seat at this point. You've seen a similar thing happen in Florida, where Florida has a lot of competitive districts, and they all pretty much uniformly went towards Republicans. The exception would be the congressional district of Stephanie Murphy's district, which has trended Democratic. But the other ones have all stayed pretty much the same, even competitive ones around urban areas. So even if the same sort of standard is applied to congressional, there may not be a huge difference. Now, legislative, obviously, that does matter, but we don't anticipate any action there that would result in the legislature not being Republican anymore. That'd be a fairly difficult feat to accomplish, even with a skilled Democratic gerrymander, which a court would certainly not order in Ohio. And it's worth noting these maps are drawn on a 4-year cycle if they don't have the Democratic buy-in in the legislature, by which point the Ohio Supreme Court could have a much more solid Republican majority. It'd be more willing to ignore some of the standards laid out or the decisions that have been laid out by previous iterations of the court. So this is something to keep an eye on, obviously. We don't know the results the court will have for the congressional districts yet, but this is a setback for Republicans at the legislative level, to be sure. So do you have any thoughts on well, not necessarily on this, but on some of the other states that are going on right now? There's litigation going on in North Carolina that's pending. There is a lawsuit, the three-judge Court of Appeals, 2 Democrats and one Democrat and 2 Republicans ruled unanimously that the congressional districts are non-judiciable, that partisan gerrymandering is not a concern that can be considered by the Supreme Court. And so they upheld the maps. Obviously, the North Carolina Supreme Court, which is controlled narrowly by Democrats, although the Democrats have several up for re-election, and it's generally considered likely the court will flip in 2022. We don't know how they'll rule on the matter. Pennsylvania obviously has pending a fiasco with their districts.
Oh, yeah. We've got a big fiasco in Pennsylvania right now.
Yeah.
I will say there has been a slight rumor that intrigues me is that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court really has been kind of uninterested in getting back into kind of this array again with the seats. There's been I don't believe it all that much, but there's been a slight rumor that they could go a Virginia path, in which they could appoint a special master from proposed by each party, who would then have to agree on a map that would be sent to the court. So that could be something that I doubt that's what would happen, but that's something that I've heard might they saw what happened to Virginia and like that. So it'll be interesting to see if something like that could happen in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and it's worth noting there's the looming specter of the frequently raised possibility of judicial candidates for the Supreme Court being elected by districts, which would obviously change incentives for a lot of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court if that were to become something passed on the ballot by Pennsylvania voters, assuming it even gets on the ballot. So I guess next up on our list, I know Dylan wanted to talk about the stock trading debate in Congress right now. There's been some surprise movement on the topic. One of the major good government ethic concerns in Congress is the ability of congressmen to trade stocks. This happens almost on a weekly basis. You'll find a congressman has violated the disclosure rules for stocks.
Can I just say that about half the time it happens, it's Tom Malinowski?
Yeah. And the other half, it's Richard Burr.
Yes.
But obviously this becomes such a common thing that there's actually proposals now to completely eliminate the ability of congressmen to buy and sell stocks. I think this was actually a Republican proposal, if I recall right.
I thought it was Spanberger and Ossoff.
Yeah, let me check to make sure. But obviously, the current disclosure rules are not working for congressmen.
No, they're working very well for congressmen.
They're working very well for congressmen, but they're not really working well for anyone else.
No.
Several Democrats proposed it. I believe Josh Hawley has talked about eliminating this ability as well. It's generally seen as a fairly major concern. The bill was introduced by John Ossoff and Mark Kelly in the Senate. And obviously, in the House, there's one that's being led by Abigail Spanberger, who is obviously now one of the more vulnerable members of the Virginia delegation. Majority Leader Nancy Pelosi is not on board with this. Surprise, surprise. There are several possible reasons for this, one of which would be having a fairly major businessman in the family. But I'll go ahead and throw it to Dylan to talk a little more about this.
So I think the movement on it is the most surprising. This seems like one of those things like the drug pricing bills that most Democrats and a lot of just general voters bipartisanly agree on it, but it's never going to happen. It's always appeared to me as one of those bills. It's just not going to happen. And Pelosi coming out publicly against it felt like the final nail in that coffin. Mm-hmm. But getting it introduced in both chambers feels like a game changer, honestly. It's hard to say, no, I'm in favor of that unless you're Pelosi and you're on your way out anyway. This seems like one of those bills that if it passes, you're going to see a lot more retirements than you already would have seen. I think a lot of people leave, and I think that's for the better. If the only reason you're there is to trade stocks on insider information, yeah, you can go. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. That said, even if it passes, I don't see it having a huge impact on any of the federal elections. Corruption is one of those issues that voters care a lot about, but they also don't care at all about. They say, oh, corruption's really bad, we should do something about it. But there have been a few candidates who have tried anti-corruption platforms, and they don't usually do better than low single digits. So I think it's a good bill. I hope it passes. I don't think it affects the electoral process that much, or the voting process that much, but I do think it could free up a bunch of seats if it passes.
Yeah. And it's worth noting, I did just look through CNBC, and they were reporting that Republicans would be willing to consider a ban, and that Minority Leader McCarthy does support stricter limits on it. In fact, I believe there are some bipartisan sponsors for the Spanberger bill. The
Hmm.
question then, with the general assumption being that the House and the Senate are somewhat likely, somewhat at least possible to flip to Republicans next cycle, to put it lightly, would likely need some Republican buy-in. The question would be whether this can be marshaled into something like last decade's limit on earmarks, the ban on earmarks, which was initially not something supported by either party, and then eventually became one that was brought on by Republicans, who part of the Tea Party wave, the more populist side of that, and also the more movement conservative side, really became mobilizing against this. And then the final nail was when President Obama said he would not sign a budget if it contained earmarks in it, and that was when Congress decided to get rid of them. Obviously, that came back lately, but it took them a good 10 years to do that.
Hmm.
And they did so with when they did so, they made sure to try and make it as more transparent at least. It wouldn't surprise me if you could get some Republicans on board for this proposal.
No,
Um,
absolutely not.
it's a genuinely bipartisan concern as long as it's enforced correctly and as long as there's arguments against it. I know
The
conservatives who are frustrated by the ability of people to be in government and make decisions and then profit off of those decisions. That's not a free market. Would be what they would argue.
Right. Though I would also argue that it would also get strong bipartisan opposition. It would
Hmm.
be a lot like anti-war efforts. You have a lot of anti-war Republicans like uh, Peter Meyer, Justin Amash, but you have more hawkish Democrats and more hawkish Republicans who could beat that back. I'm not sure
Hmm.
whether this passes. I think it should, but especially in the House, I think it's dead on arrival
Hmm.
unless Republicans take the House and McCarthy is actually in favor of it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that he's definitely in favor of it. I think it's an easy way for him to take a shot at Nancy Pelosi, and
Hmm.
I'm skeptical that he's for it, but maybe he is.
And maybe it's a way to, if you're a Republican and you have a choice between, you got to do something to handle the more populist corruption oriented side. You can get rid of earmarks, or you can get rid of stock trading. There's if it's one of the two, I think there would be some members of Congress who would be more willing to get rid of stock trading than get rid of earmarks. They may have their own financial situations much better, or
Hmm.
they may not really care about that, but they may really want the ability to bring pork back to a district and run on that. That could very well be a possibility. This is all speculation, of course, but I think there are positive signs that there could be some sort of movement on this issue. Whether or not you agree with the issue or not, it's certainly something that's become a little bit more visible lately because of some very, very high profile uh, overreaches during the COVID crisis, buying and trading stuff relating to prescription drugs, to vaccines, just generally not ideal things to be trading on in a pandemic, to put it
Yeah,
lightly.
and credit to John Ossoff. He's the only one who's kind of been hammering away at this in the Senate
Hmm.
vocally. So, I mean, I think it helps to have a senator actively pushing and actively using his bully pulpit for it.
Especially one who's not up for re-election for another 5 to 6 years.
Yeah,
Not running on this as a campaign message, basically, because he doesn't have to.
no, this is just something he believes, which good for him.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so, speaking of COVID, we'll go ahead and move on to our next one, which is the fairly substantial shift in rhetoric and policy going around regarding COVID-19 and schooling. For those who've been following the most recently in Chicago, the teachers union there held a strike, a very brief work stoppage, um, in response to the Omicron variant. The result of this was surprising. Was Mayor Lori Lightfoot, a fairly liberal Democrat, although obviously um, that would depend on what you would think. She wasn't endorsed by the teachers union in the last mayoral election. She certainly wasn't the choice of progressives in that. But
Hmm.
she laid a very, very heavy hand on the union, basically demanding they return to work. And with a handful of very minor and useless concessions, they since have returned to work. You're seeing this with other Democratic politicians, states like Colorado with Governor Jared Polis, who are becoming much more openly skeptical of school closures in relating to this. And recent polling seems to back this up, that the people are willing to take a lot of COVID restrictions at this point, or at least be open to them. The one they're not open to is schooling. So I'll go ahead and kind of throw this to the panel here to discuss, but it seems like this has been a fairly major shift and could be a political issue to some degree in 2022.
Yeah, it feels like it's something that's almost in part the response to Virginia, where school closures became an issue in that election. It does feel like a response, and maybe an understanding by some politicians in these states that this is an issue that is starting to cross the partisan boundary. Back when COVID started, or kind of in the middle of it when we're talking about last fall, in 2020, it wasn't an issue that really transcended political boundaries, but now we're starting to see it kind of transcend. We're starting to kind of see an issue bleed into I personally saw it in my spring classes. I had multiple professors who were, I figured were our liberals who lived in Arlington, who were upset that their children still had to be in online school. Younger children had to be in online school instead of going to school when cases were down and it was the springtime and things seemed to be able to be changing. They were upset that their schools were not, staying up, were not, at least going to some type of hybrid formation. This is an issue that last spring started to kind of bleed through the partisan lines, and we're kind of finally seeing a reaction to that in some way. I think Governor Jared Polis is someone who's kind of always been on the other side of this for a Democrat. He's someone who's certainly taken a more, I guess you could say, freedom-based. He's always been kind of what's been described as a left-wing libertarian, I'd say, by some people. He's got some of those different policy views that not too many Democrats usually have when it comes to certain personal freedoms and personal liberties, and also economic freedoms that not a lot of Democrats hold nowadays. But, now we're starting to see it. We saw with Mayor Lightfoot, someone who, while was not the most progressive Democrat in that Chicago mayoral election, is still a progressive Democrat, someone who's changing. We saw Eric Adams, of course, elected in New York City. He's someone who campaigned against school, who said he would not close the schools in New York City, and it's kind of, we're seeing this kind of across the country right now, where school closures are just not very popular. People want their kids in schools, especially since we now have multiple vaccines and multiple boosters for those vaccines available to the general public. It's
except for young kids.
Except for very, and even at this point, it's very young children. I believe it's only 5 and unders now, who that's not available for. So, most of those kids aren't necessarily even going to school. Only maybe the 4 and the 5-year-olds who go to preschools. At this point, most kids who are in regular public or private school settings can get vaccinated and boosted, so it's becoming a continually frustrating thing, I think, for a lot of parents. And I think, again, it has started to really bleed the partisan lines here, as now, since we have these options available, I think we're seeing those frustrations start to boil over in certain areas, and it's starting to bleed into our politics now, for sure.
Yeah, I would actually argue, I don't know if Dylan can back this up, but I would argue that Virginia was a big deal. I'd argue New Jersey being close is another.
Yes.
Nobody expects Colorado to be competitive in the gubernatorial race. Nobody. If there's someone who's telling you they expect this race to be much of a contest at this point, they're probably not being that serious. But the fact that Jared Polis is taking this seriously is indicative of one of two things. One, a genuine ideological conviction, which is probably the case, but also electoral pressures. He's not the only Democratic governor doing this, and he's not the only Democratic official doing this. You don't do this unless you believe it or you have genuine pressure from your party. And that's a fairly substantial shift from last year. Early in the pandemic, I believe it was March 2020, was about 90% of people, when surveyed, said they thought school closures were reasonable to prevent the spread of the virus. This is before the vaccine. This is before we had the major widespread treatments we have right now. This is before teachers were put very early in the line to get vaccinated, ahead of most other people. Now, you look at polling, I believe it's somewhere around 70 to 80% of people at least want an in-person option for education. Even if they don't want schools fully open, they want that to be at least an option. And people seem to be generally letting their kids take that option. Obviously, some of it can be attributed to school boards, but I think really the more pressure is more organically just looking at the base, looking at how people are voting, and looking at recent elections where that's been an issue. I think it's just genuine political people starting to realize there may be a little bit more something to that than expected.
Yeah, I mean, people have kept their kids home for almost a year at this point. They're, whether right or wrong, whether you think school closures are a valid policy option or not, you can't deny that it's a burden on parents if they don't have other options. I mean, what somebody has to stay home with younger kids, and that's going to be an incredible economic burden. If you're not going to give those people help, then you need to give them another option, especially after a year. I mean, that's just, you can't expect people to stay home for a year and not be frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
New Jersey being close was shocking. It ended up being about 4 points, which isn't super close, but it's close. It's closer than New Jersey should be.
Mm-hmm.
I I don't know how much of that was driven by school closures. I think the Virginia race is a much more obvious case of school closures being political pressure. But I th- I think there are ways to do school openings even in light of Omicron and keep both the teachers and the students safe. I don't think it has to be an either or, all or nothing approach, and that seems to be all people want to do at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to raise one more possibility here, which is something that would have a fairly major impact. This is actually driving a wedge between Democratic politicians and their traditional allies in labor, education labor unions. Um, for those who are not don't keep track of labor policy or keep track of donations, one of the most consistent donors and supporters of the Democratic Party is the National Education Association and the National Federation of Teachers, both of which have been traditionally very skeptical, at least recently, of reopening schools and then specifically of putting teachers back to work. And that's when you think of realize labor unions are a lobbying organization for employees. That makes sense that they would be lobbying on behalf of their employees. The problem
Mm-hmm.
for Democrats comes is either one, alienating the labor unions, or two, the labor unions losing influence in the Democratic Party, both of which would have fairly substantial ramifications in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
Republicans are actually becoming even more hostile to teacher unions and their interests in general. So it's not like they can just go to the Republicans and start supporting candidates. It's a matter, if they push too far here, you could end up with a bunch of backlash that hurts you long term. The traditional example that comes up would be the PATCO strike federally in the early on in the Reagan administration. PATCO had actually been a union that had endorsed Ronald Reagan. They had been supportive of him. When they held a strike, Reagan fired all of the PATCO people who didn't go back to work, banned them from federal employment for a period of time, and basically destroyed that labor union. Um, Obviously, that's unlikely to happen with a teachers union, but if you watch the Lori Lightfoot press conference, she was pretty irritated, to put it lightly, at the Chicago Teachers Union, and was already not on good terms to begin with.
Yeah,
Uh,
and the teachers union is doing exactly what it should be. It's voicing the concern of the people it represents. They're
mhm.
they're doing they're doing their job. They're I'm sure there's something that Democratic politicians could work out if they had the political will. But as we'll get to in the next topic, Democrats and political will don't go hand in hand at all.
Yeah, and they're going to have to decide whether or not they want to do that and what approach they want to take, because clearly the school closure route is just not going to happen at this point. It's not a
No.
viable option. It's
Mm-mm.
not something the Biden administration is floating. It's not something Democratic governors are floating. It's really
And
not a viable strategy
no.
in the long term or in the short term, for sure. But speaking of going more to what Dylan had talked about earlier, we're going to move on to the big topic of the day, which is recent action on the filibuster and specifically the speech from Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, which has attracted a lot of attention. We were originally going to cover Biden's speech yesterday, which met with a decidedly mixed reception, decrying Republican voter bills, election bills, and legislatures, and basically declaring the need to pass the Democratic electoral bills, H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, specifically citing Jim Crow and Bull Connor and a bunch of other very, very bad things in justification of why you need to support this bill to prevent that from happening again. Some commentators immediately suggested this is a little bit too over the top because the target here was Democratic senators, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, but several others as well who are not named publicly, but who are clearly skeptical of getting rid of the filibuster. Today, Kyrsten Sinema held her speech just a little bit earlier, I believe it was a few hours ago, in which she laid out her reasons for opposing any shift on the filibuster. She specifically mentioned the issues with having policy shifting so regularly, having radical policies passed by one party and without any input from the other, and how this could be used to hurt Democratic interests as well as Republican interests. And even though she supports both of the bills, she also expressed a displeasure with the Democratic leadership for not reaching out to Republicans to find any sort of common ground on the matter. Kind of goes back to what we talked about last week with the Electoral Counting Act, how it makes no sense to not focus at least a little bit on that and take a win when you can get it. She certainly seemed a little bit frustrated on that topic. Immediately after her speech, Joe Manchin issued a statement saying he also opposed to make any action on the filibuster. To those who have been following Senators Manchin and Sinema, this is not a surprise. They have said basically the same thing for a year now, that they oppose changing the filibuster. Any concessions Manchin has made on the matter have been concessions that wouldn't actually do anything. He's always said that you need 67 votes to change Senate rules, which Democrats obviously do not have right now and never will have. His proposals to reduce debate times or do anything, none of them would actually affect the fact that you need 60 votes to pass legislation in the Senate. Anything he's proposed would not change that. So I'll go ahead and throw it here. What do you guys think of Senator Sinema's speech? Where do you see things going forward from here? And what's the ultimate fate of these Democratic election bills, which seem like an ill-timed pivot from the Build Back Better agenda, which also was not going to pass?
We're going nowhere. Those bills are going absolutely nowhere, as I thought they would from the beginning. Sinema's speech is almost a non-issue. Like, we've heard this from her so many times. Why is it a story still? But people still seem surprised by it. But I do think Manchin made the smarter play in terms of media, just putting out a statement. Sinema just gave sound bites, several sound bites, to her 2024 primary challengers, which will come. She will be primaried. Ruben Gallego called her out by name in a speech on the House floor today. She will face a primary challenge. I'm confused as to why she decided to do a speech instead of just put out a press release as she's done so many times before. It seems like a political miscalculation, but this is not surprising. Those voting rights bills have been dead since the moment they were put forward. Unless the filibuster was going to be changed, and filibuster reform was dead the moment Cal Cunningham lost in North Carolina, and the moment Sarah Gideon lost in Maine. So I'm not surprised by any of it. Biden's speech, even if I take no issue with the content, generally I don't take much issue with the content. It was fine. It's a bad speech if you're trying to court Manchin and Sinema, whose one personality trait is we want bipartisanship. Calling the people they want bipartisanship with segregationists is a bad way to win them over.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a speech that I think pretty much draws the line in the sand finally. I think that's why she made the speech. I feel like just to kind of probably end up out of annoyance for, kind of the continuing round, will they, won't they? I very much feel like this was a speech that was meant to kind of just say, this is done, this is over, we're done with this now. I will not move on the filibuster and kind of really truly drawing the line in that sand. And it's a gamble. It's a gamble that Sinema has taken, and I think in part she is potentially gambling on Senator Mark Kelly losing in 2022. Because
not much of a gamble.
In some ways she is betting, maybe not, I shouldn't say gambling, but I would say betting on Senator Kelly losing in 2022. And I've seen this thrown around, and I don't disagree with this theory from people I follow online. I don't necessarily disagree with this take, is that I think she sees that if Kelly loses, it kind of promotes herself in theory in Arizona, saying Kelly's way doesn't work, my way will work, and I will get reelected here. In a way to try and maybe force those in the Arizona Democratic Party to say, we might have to hold on to this lady still for now.
If I may though, sorry. What is the Kelly way? He's been very quiet.
To kind of just be, I would say regular Democrat. The Kelly way is just being regular Democrat.
The Kelly way is to sit in the basement and raise a lot of money and also not have an affair with your wife. That's the in comparison to the Cunningham strategy. He seemed to work a lot better. I'll just put it lightly.
Yes. I mean, I agree that that's probably her calculation, that she's probably betting on Kelly losing. I think that's a solid bet given everything we know about how the midterms are shaping up. But I don't see that case being super compelling, especially if she's going to end up at the top of the ticket, or not at the top of the ticket, I'm sorry. She's up in 2024, so she'd be running with a Democratic president, billing herself as, oh, I'm not like the other Democrats. Seems like a fraught strategy in a presidential year. Maybe in a midterm, that's a decent strategy, but it seems fraught in a year that a Democrat is going to be running at the top of the ticket.
I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I think as we've seen throughout her 4 years in the Senate, Sinema very clearly goes her own way.
Mm-hmm.
She very clearly has a set of principles that kind of align herself with going her own way, whether that's smart in the sense of a primary electorate right now in Arizona, I think is highly debatable. Ruben Gallego will run against
absolutely
2024. I think there is no doubt that he is going to be the one to run. Ruben Gallego will run against Kyrsten Sinema. Now that there are risks, people are going to bring up the idea that there are risks, that Gallego has never run in anything competitive bar Democratic primary before. He was in a safe state house seat when he was in the Arizona House of Representatives. He's been in the safe deep blue Democratic seat since he's been in the United States House of Representatives. There are going to be people who argue that when the time comes, and I'm sure that's going to be a statement that I'm sure that is going to be a statement that we see here. I think when it comes to Gallego and Sinema, which I think is almost certainly going to be a highly to watch primary. And while I think those points that will be brought up by the Sinema campaign, I think should matter, the fact is that I think Ruben Gallego probably matches the primary electorate better in kind of the way they think. It could end up being a very interesting Senate election in Arizona where you kind of see I'm not going to say extreme, but the more partisan sides of each party, potentially in Gallego, and then, throwing a name out there. Andy Biggs. We got Andy Biggs. No, that's too far. Debbie Lesko. Debbie Lesko versus Ruben Gallego in 2024 for Arizona Senate seat. It could be very interesting, but that's a far way into the future. And I don't know if we necessarily need to be thinking about it that far. But Sinema clearly has a different idea in how she wants to be a senator. She clearly is trying to propose herself as very much similar to John McCain. Someone who will split from the party on potentially certain key issues, not just on maybe a nominee or two, or maybe a judicial nominee or two, or maybe a bill that was probably already unpopular with the general consensus. she is someone who is going to split with the party on key issues, as McCain did, especially in the last 10 or so years of his tenure.
Sure. I think the difference that I think Sinema is underestimating is that John McCain split with Republicans on key issues, but he also voted with Republicans on most key issues. He split here and there, but he was largely a party line vote. Sinema has taken very public oppositional stances against almost every Democratic priority that's been brought up this year. That's not a great position to be in when you do have to face a primary. McCain could at least say, "Oh, I voted for all of these Republican bills." Sinema can't say that.
But she can actually. She's voted for every major Democratic priority that's been put up. I think she has a 100% voting rate with Joe Biden. The thing is, she hasn't. The big major Democratic things haven't actually been brought up yet.
Mostly
that's the
because
major
she's been
distinction.
holding them up.
Yeah, but she can always point to that. Like, it's hard to argue with a 100% voting record with your party. McCain never had that. He had
No,
he had a much lower. Even when Republicans had bills passed, he wouldn't necessarily be on board with them.
no. I think the difference between McCain and Sinema, though, in that respect, is McCain was more quiet in his opposition, so those bills would get brought forward because you didn't know how he was going to go. Sinema very publicly and early on will deny it and will hold up a bill. Voting rights or Build Back Better, obviously. She'll very publicly do it before the bill even has a chance to die. Just my take.
But yeah, I do consider it likely that Ruben Gallego does vote for or does run in 20 run a primary Senator Sinema in 2024. I do question whether he would actually be broadly electable in Arizona. He is a very, very progressive member of the House. Obviously, Republicans have their own issue with nominating unelectable candidates in the state of Arizona, but Gallego is very much outside of the political mainstream of Arizona, at least for right now. What may be mainstream within the Democratic Party there is a little bit more challenging when you do need a lot of people who voted for Republicans as recently as 4 years ago, to vote for you.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know what the landscape will even look like in 4 years.
Yeah.
Sinema could become much more quiet in the next couple years. Or Gallego could moderate out in preparation for a run, or the party could move significantly left, and he does become sort of the center of the party.
Yeah, there's a bunch of options to choose from here.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, with that, I think that kind of wraps up all of what we were planning on discussing. Any last thoughts before we close off for the day?
No?
All right. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. We appreciate your support for Elections Daily and supporting our content. You can follow me on Twitter at DECunningham2. And Joe, you can follow him at Joseph Szymanski on Twitter. And Dylan, you can follow at Dylan B. Wade. Dylan B. Wade 1, I should say. Also, all of the articles they produced are on Elections Daily. You can find us at elections_daily on Twitter and at elections-daily.com. Be sure to sign up for our email list there. You'll get emails from Decision Desk HQ, our friends and I guess new corporate overlords, if you want to put it as a joke. But they include our articles in their weekly newsletter if you want to sign up for that. And you can always, if you like our content, you can like our channel and subscribe to it, or like our content, whatever podcast provider you're listening to this at. We appreciate you guys' support, and thank you for watching or listening, and we'll be back next week.